today's hearing is to record and consider testimony from the public regarding air quality concerns relating to Sierra Pacific Industries' air permit application. Sierra Pacific Industries' application seeks to renovate the lumber mill located on the Shelton waterfront, which was previously owned by Simpson Lumber Company, LLC. In addition, Sierra Pacific Industries requests a voluntary limit on carbon monoxide and a limit on the annual production of kiln-dried lumber. The rules for our conduct are printed up here. I don't think I'll go through them, but we're asking folks to limit their testimony to 5 minutes. I'm doing the agenda. Okay, sorry. My name is Fran McNair, and I'm the Executive Director for the Olympic Region Clean Air Agency and the Hearings Officer for tonight's hearing on the preliminary staff recommendation on the notice of construction for Sierra Pacific Industries. On behalf of the Olympic Region Clean Air Agency, thank you for coming, and I'd like to introduce the staff that's here. Mark Gooden is sitting here. He's the principal engineer. Debbie Moody over here is the office manager for ORCAA and the hearing recorder for tonight. And Dan Nelson is the ORCAA Public Information Officer.
Thanks for coming out tonight. Hopefully we won't be overpowered by the dance music, but I think all of us have powerful enough voices you can hear us. The purpose, again, tonight is for a hearing to record and consider testimony from the public regarding air quality concerns relating to Sierra Pacific Industries' preliminary staff recommendation on a notice of construction, or that's ORCAA's preliminary staff recommendation. The ground rules are pretty simple. We've got basic rules here. During the public testimony portion of the hearing, persons wishing to testify must have signed in, provide name and address on the sign-up sheet. We'll call you in the order you did sign up. Please, when you do testify, state your name clearly for the record prior to making any comments. And comments are being recorded. We'll transcribe your comments and respond to those following the close of the public comment period. Testimony must be limited to air quality issues and concerns related to the proposed NOC under consideration. Testimony should be brief and non-repetitive, limited to 5 minutes. Written comments can be presented in lieu of or in addition to your testimony. Written comments should include your name and address, and there's a box up on one of the tables, so you can just put them on the table with Debbie. Staff presentations and the public testimony should be directed to our hearings officer, Ms. McNair. We ask that you be courteous to other speakers, no side conversations. If you have a side conversation, please step outside. Any disruptive behaviors, we'll ask you to stop. The hearing will be adjourned. Restrooms, if anybody needs them, are over here. If anybody has your cell phone in your pocket, please turn it to silent mode. Process for tonight. At tonight's hearing, the hearings officer, Fran McNair's job is to conduct the hearing by listening to staff presentation and public comments. She may ask questions where clarification is needed. If you have questions as part of your testimony, staff will address them in writing following the public comment period. They will not be answered tonight. Staff presentation, Mark Gooden will present a brief presentation covering the preliminary staff recommendation for the NOC and their recommendation to the hearings officer. Public testimony, those signed up to testify will be given 5 minutes per person to testify. Debbie will give you a 1-minute warning sign to alert you to wrap up your comments. As I said, in lieu of oral testimony, you may submit written comments. Written comments will be accepted through 11:59 tonight through email. So if you have last-minute comments, get them to us before midnight. To receive a copy of the comments, answers, and the final determination, you must sign in, present or provide your mailing address and or email address so we can provide you with that future correspondence. Explanation of the decision process. The subject of the hearing, only air-related testimony will be considered by ORCAA in rendering a final decision. Decision authority, the final decision regarding the preliminary notice of construction will be made by the hearings officer. When comments have been addressed, she will once again evaluate the staff recommendation, all of the comments and responses to those, and make a decision which will be shared with the ORCAA Board of Directors. The timing of that decision is based upon the number of comments received and the time it takes to address them all fully. The final decision notice will be presented to persons on the hearing attendance list, persons who have expressed an interest in the project, and those who have provided written testimony. After a final determination has been made, there is a right to appeal. The final decision prepared by ORCAA may be appealed to the Pollution Controls Hearing Board. Appeals must be made within 30 days from the final notice of final action by ORCAA. And the procedures on that appeal process are available, I believe, on the front table, or we've got them here as well. And we'll start the testimony and presentations now.
I'm Fran McNair, hearings officer for this hearing. This evening we are conducting a hearing to record and consider testimony from the public regarding air quality concerns relating to Sierra Pacific Industries' preliminary recommendation for the notice of construction. Let the record show it is 5:36 on February 1st, 2016. This hearing is being held at the Shelton Civic Center, 525 West Costa Street, Shelton, Washington. Legal notices of this hearing were published in the following: Olympic Region Clean Air Agency website for at least 30 days, email alert sent out on December 28th, 2015, paid advertising in the Olympian on December 30th, 2015, and the Shelton Mason County Journal on December 31st, 2015. In addition, copies of ORCAA's preliminary recommendation, Ecology's health impacts assessment, and Sierra Pacific's notice of construction applications are on file and available for review, have been on file and available for review at the Timberline Public Library located at 710 West Alden Street, Shelton, and at ORCAA's Olympia office. ORCAA staff report compliance with air regulations will be presented by Mark Gooden. Public testimony, Dan Nelson will call the names for public testimony. As a hearings officer, if I need, I will ask questions for clarification, and then at the end, I'll close the hearing. After all testimony has been presented, I, as a hearing examiner, will close the public hearing, indicating time of closure. So at this point, we will begin with the staff presentation.
Okay, my name is Mark Gooden. I'm the professional engineer for Olympic Region Clean Air Agency, and I was the engineer assigned to the Sierra Pacific Shelton Mill renovation project. I'll be presenting staff's conclusions and recommendation to Fran McNair, the hearings examiner for this case, and Fran will render a decision after hearing staff's recommendation and any public testimony that we receive tonight. So I'll get right on it. Just in the way of the background, for sake of the public, Olympic Region Clean Air Agency has jurisdiction over 6 counties in western Washington, and we administer the state's Clean Air Act. And we do a variety of tasks. We issue air operating permits. We do new source review, and that's the subject for tonight's hearing. We do inspections and enforcement. We can issue tickets. We respond to complaints. So this particular case involves this project site here, located on the waterfront in Shelton, and it involves renovating the lumber mill at this vicinity that was previously owned by the Simpson Timber Company, now owned by Sierra Pacific Industries. And I just want to go through just briefly a broad brush overview of the project. This project will involve demolishing the existing sawmill, plater mill, and plywood plant at that facility. Sierra Pacific will retain the existing wood fire boiler It's a Wellens boiler and the existing natural gas-fired boiler. And in fact, the existing wood-fired boiler is continuing operation today. It burns biomass, and it will continue operation up to the point that the Olympic Panel Products facility shuts down, and that's scheduled sometime this year and no later than December 31st, 2016. So that the boiler is existing, it's emitting right now, and when Sierra Pacific Industries renovates the mill, it'll take custody of that boiler and continue operation as it has been in the past. Part of their project will involve renovating the mill, and that means they will reconfigure the mill and the log yard. They will rebuild the sawmill and planer mill. There's going to be 10 new dry kilns. They'll replace the existing lumber dry kilns. There will be a complete new residuals handling system, and what I mean by residuals is lumber mills generate a lot of sawdust and wood residual dust, and it can accumulate, and it needs to be dealt with, and so the systems used to capture and transport those materials is going to be completely new. They'll have a new anti-mold spray system and a new log yard. So I point out that the dry kilns, the residuals handling systems, the anti-mold spray system, and the log yard are all considered air pollution sources under the state's Clean Air Act, and because they're new, it triggers ORCAA's review and approval through this notice of construction. But the existing Wellens boiler does not. It is going to be used as is and will continue to operate, and then will operate the same when Sierra Pacific takes over the mill. Okay, so new equipment that's subject to new source review, again, dry kilns, residuals handling system, anti-mold system, and log yard. Equipment that's not subject to new source review, the boilers, the fuel house, and the fuel house cyclone and bag house. And this is all these determinations of what triggers new source review and what doesn't is all consistent with the state's Clean Air Act under 7094 RCW and ORCAA's own regulations under that act. Under the state's Clean Air Act, there's some specific criteria for approving any new source. And so part of the bulk of our review consisted of determining that the new dry kilns, new residuals handling system, anti-mold system, and log yard will comply with these criteria of approval. And just to go over those real quickly, there's number one, there may be some performance standards that apply specifically to these units. Number two, there's an overarching requirement in the state of Washington that any new source of air pollution use what's called best available control technology, or BACT. And we determine this for each emissions unit. Number three, there's the Washington Air Toxics Regulation. And our review consisted of two parts. There was a Tier 1 or screening level review that ORCAA conducted. And then certain air pollutants triggered a Tier 2 review under the Washington Air Toxics Regulation. And that was performed by the Department of Ecology. I'll go over that briefly. Number four, we needed to determine whether or not this triggered a PSD air permit. PSD stands for Prevention of Significant Deterioration. It's a permit that's required for really large projects. And I'll go over that. And then fifth, the ambient air quality standards. We required Sierra Pacific to hire a consultant and do an ambient air quality analysis that determines impacts in the surrounding community and compares those with the ambient air quality standards. So the first criteria of approval, performance standards, this is an easy answer here. There are no new performance standards that are triggered by this project. The boiler is going to be operated as is. It's subject to the federal boiler standards and certain state boiler standards. That's not changing. The dry kilns don't have any specific performance standards aside from ORCAA's imposition of best available control technology. So the short answer here is there's no new performance standards that are triggered as a result of this project. As far as best available control technology, we reviewed Sierra Pacific's application and determined that the control technology that they are proposing meets the state's definition and requirements for best available control technology. You can see here what's being proposed. The dry kilns will have an energy management system, and it will minimize the amount of heat and steam going to the dry kilns. But most importantly, it's an ability to regulate drying temperature, and temperature at which lumber is dried is important to the amount of emissions coming out. So they have agreed to maintaining temperatures below 200 Fahrenheit, and we have conditions that'll assure that in the long run. When they do that, they will minimize emissions, and that's considered best available control technology for lumber dry kilns. The residual systems, and this is residual systems is comprised of cyclones that will remove particulate from air streams and bag houses. Sierra Pacific has agreed to completely enclose all conveyors that's moving residuals, and all emissions from the residuals transport systems, whether they be air-blown chips and sawdust or conveyor-blown or conveyor chips and sawdust. Eventually, any air that's scavenged from those systems will be exhausted through bag houses, and there's conditions that we're recommending to assure that. For the log yard, Sierra Pacific is proposing to have a completely paved log yard that will be periodically cleaned. This is considered BACT. And for the anti-mold system, this is a system used to treat lumber so that it doesn't mold and it doesn't stain. They're proposing a mist eliminator, and this will scavenge out any excess solutions that are used to treat the lumber from the airstream that's exhausted. So they're going to have this mist eliminator to minimize the amount going up through their stack. Plus, they're proposing use of very low VOC solutions. VOC stands for volatile organic compounds. So we determined that this set of control technologies being proposed constitutes BACT, or best available control technology. For the air toxics regulation, ORCAA reviewed Sierra Pacific's what we call a first tier screening level review of air toxics, and basically the 4 air toxics that will be emitted, and these are emitted by the lumber dry kilns: formaldehyde, methanol, acetaldehyde, and acrolein. Formaldehyde and methanol are emitted in such small amounts that they screened out, and they're not a concern, so they pass the air toxics analysis. Acetaldehyde and acrolein were above the what we call the small quantity emission rate, and those being that they were above the small quantity emission rate, they triggered what we call a Tier 2 analysis, which is handled by the Department of Ecology's air program with their in-house toxicologists. And so Sierra Pacific submitted a health risk analysis to the Department of Ecology consistent with their protocol for such analyses, and determined that ORCAA can go ahead with approving the project, that there's no excess health risk or concern from acetaldehyde and acrolein. And actually, let me, here's the conclusion that came from ecology. Sierra Pacific emissions will add to the existing air pollution exposures. That's kind of a no-brainer. They're going to increase emissions somewhat, but the increase in emissions is not likely to appreciably contribute to long-term respiratory hazards in the vicinity of the facility. Okay, so this was the conclusion from Department of Ecology, and this outcome is one of the requirements to proceed with approval for our ORCAA. Regarding PSD air permit, and again, this is for very, very large facilities. And PSD stands for Prevention of Significant Deterioration. It's a federal air permit program applying in areas with relatively good air quality and to really big projects. It's administered by the Washington Department of Ecology. And in this case, a PSD permit does not apply. Carbon monoxide is the only pollutant with the potential to emit, that's what PTE stands for, that could possibly trigger PSD in this case. And in this case, Sierra Pacific Industries has agreed to limit their carbon monoxide emissions to less than 149 tons per year. I think I have that number right. I better check that number. Essentially, they've agreed to limit their carbon monoxide emissions to below the threshold that would otherwise trigger a PSD permit.
Can I ask a question?
No.
We're going to withhold
Not at this
questions.
time.
Okay.
If the hearings officer agrees.
Okay, and the last criteria for approval is the ambient air quality standards. An ambient analysis was triggered for particulate matter, and only. There's other pollutants being emitted at the mill, but the only one that triggered an ambient analysis was particulate emissions. And in this ambient analysis that Sierra Pacific contracted out to have completed, it was completed by Ramble Environmental, ORCAA required that all particulate emissions from the mill be modeled. Okay, not just emissions from the project, the kilns, the residuals handling system, and the log yard and the anti-mold system, but everything, including the boilers. So it's a cumulative analysis for the mill. We also required that the ambient analysis include background air quality, and the results demonstrate compliance with both the 24-hour and the annual particulate matter ambient standards. I also have to point out that through this analysis, one of the results is ORCAA will be imposing a particulate matter limit to ratchet down the particulate matter emissions from the Wellens boiler. And the reason for that is there's several reasons for that. One is there's a fairly big margin between the current limit and the actual emissions from that boiler. And when Sierra Pacific went to modeling this boiler, they took an educated look at what is a better estimate of actual emissions from that boiler based on stack tests. And they modeled at, I believe it was 0.37 pounds per million BTU, which is less than the current limit. So staff is recommending that limit be ratcheted down to what was modeled for future protection of particulate matter standards in the area. So the outcome of this is they did demonstrate compliance with the ambient standards, and ORCAA will be imposing a limit that ratchets down on the particulate matter from that boiler. And here are the results. You can see that background ambient particulate matter contributes greatly to the maximum impact. Apologize for being in the way. But I want to point out here too, this graph represents the worst possible impact from at the point of maximum impact. So it represents one small point in outside the property boundary and the absolute worst case impact. The requirement here in state regulations and the State Clean Air Act is that they demonstrate compliance, and they have. So a couple other things before I move on to staff recommendations, and that is there's a couple other things going on that were not included in the normal review that we do under the Washington Clean Air Act, and that is we have Olympic panel products will be shutting down. There's going to be some emission decreases due to Olympic panel products shutting down. Those are not quantified nor for this analysis, nor did they weigh in, but they will happen nonetheless. And we did receive some public comments during the 30-day public notice and comment period, and there was some concern over carbon monoxide emissions, so I'm expecting we're going to hear some testimony on carbon monoxide emissions. Carbon monoxide emissions are largely not a part of this project because the boiler was not subject to new source review. We're only dealing with the dry kilns, the residuals handling system, and a mold system in log yard. And carbon monoxide is not emitted from those units. However, there is carbon monoxide emitted from the boiler, okay? And we did have to limit the carbon monoxide for sake of the project qualifying for the exemption from PSD or not triggering PSD. So with that, staff's recommendations are that we recommend conditional approval, and the conditions that we're recommending are in our preliminary determination, which I know you read and has been out for public notice and comment. We're also recommending that once this gets approved, that we have to reopen their air operating permit to roll in these recommended conditions of approval from this action into the air operating permit. So with that, I'll close and answer any questions, but that in a nutshell is the process that we went through.
So at this point, we will, hearing no questions from the hearings officer for staff, we'll go into the public testimony. As of now, it looks like we only have one individual wishing to speak. Conley, and I can't read your last name.
Watson.
Okay.
Thank you, madam. Or, sir. My name is Conley Watson. I live at 140 East Fox Lane out in Hartstein Island. And I've gone through this a lot of times in the past since I've retired. And I chose codes and RCWs when started, and I didn't know if you, do you work under this? Because, well, this is the old book, but the new one out, which is at the library in the bottom shelf, is the 2015, the code. And I will read for you National Standards Institute of August 5th. This was the year These started in 1897, and they still go on today. And anything that they print today supersedes all of these going all the way back to 1897. And what they really consist of is fire. They're really worried, and I have some marked in here on government safety, and particularly sawdust, which they plan to burn to create the biomass, which creates energy. They want to sell it back to Bonneville. Now, I do have right here from PUD 3 and PUD 1, they don't buy any Bonneville. They buy from Bonneville, but they don't buy any biomass. And would
yes.
Now, Bonneville covers the 8 western states. If there's a problem there, and I wanted to say on the last thing there, did you consider the carbon monoxide from the trucks? Just a point, right here, I wanted to really quick just read this. Emergency systems are systems legally required and classified as emergency. They will redo all the egress for bells and whistles and lights so if there is a fire, that the fire marshal can get in here and the public can be exited. Emergency systems. And then what I really was curious about was the dust, which is spontaneous combustion. And I've had to redo them. Besides the lighting, which had to be explosion proof, I had to do the mags and all the light switches, the plugs and everything. They had no drilled holes in them, and they were explosion proof because of the dust and the spontaneous combustion. Thank you.
All right. Anyone else present that would like to present testimony this evening? Hearing none, I'll turn it over to our hearings officer.
So after all testimony has been presented, I will close the public hearing at 6:02 on February 1st. Preliminary recommendation for the notice of construction. I will evaluate the legal and technical merits of each comment received today. Only after all relevant legal and technical issues have been addressed will I consider authorizing ORCAA staff to issue a final determination. Final determination will be issued and will be communicated in writing to those persons who signed in on the mailing list or who provided testimony and or written comments. It will also be posted on ORCAA's website. ORCAA staff will send written responses to comments and questions presented during today's public hearing and those submitted in writing prior to or during the hearing, and as Dan indicated, up until 11:59 this evening. To ensure you receive a copy, you must sign in and provide your mailing address on the hearing attendance list. And we appreciate if you have an email for future correspondence or for email alerts. Within 30 days from the notice of final determination, so once I make my final recommendation, anyone may appeal the order to the State of Washington Pollution Control Hearings Board by filing an appeal in writing with the Pollution Control Hearings Board and serving a copy also to ORCAA. And as mentioned earlier, the forms are out on the table. So with that, I will close this evening. And I thank everyone for attending.